my niece, who was 20 years old, was attending Indiana University, and she was a pre-med student there. She was in a car accident and was prescribed hydrocodone, Vicodin, which is an opiate painkiller. And she was taking the drugs, and they were causing her such severe sedative properties that she wasn't able to study. So she was trying to pull an all-nighter with some friends to study for an exam the next day, and she went to a local health food store and purchased some ephedra, which is a stimulant. She took that concomitantly with her drug and had an adverse reaction. And she ended up in a local hospital, and they labeled her as bipolar and started giving her the whole gamut of antidepressants and mood stabilizers and antipsychotics and all of that. And then she became a mental patient. And I'd like to back up and just say that part of the problem of being labeled in the first place is that those labels go into a medical history, a familial medical history, so that when additional family members who may have the same predisposition to having adverse events, just like I did, because if we're genetically related, we can have some of the same genes, then those individuals will automatically be labeled when they come up symptomatic because of their relatives. So she had mentioned that she had an aunt who was bipolar, etc.
And they said,
oh, exactly. So no one even entertained the idea that she was having an adverse drug reaction. And of course, because she was toxic, that was the reason she was having the event. And when they added additional drugs, she became more toxic and she became more seriously ill. And at one point, she then got a schizophrenia diagnosis instead of a bipolar diagnosis. And she was on a cocktail of almost 14 different drugs by the time that it was all said and done.
Wow.
So she had to drop out of school. She was unable to work or to really have any kind or any semblance of a normal life. And eventually she came here to Texas to live with me. And she was trying to get off of her drugs. She was detoxifying. She was doing everything that she could naturally. And because she could not overcome her paranoia and she could not heal quickly enough, my sister was advised to have her put back on drugs. And so my sister called her one day and told her that she had to do something about this. She had to take care of it, and that she had made an appointment for her and that she was taking her back to the psychiatrist and she was going to go back on drugs. Because I'd like to back up and just say that if you don't slowly titrate or slowly wean yourself off of a psychiatric drug, you can throw your body into a complete tailspin. And this is what had happened to my niece. When she determined that it was the drugs that were harming her, she stopped taking them cold turkey. And she went into an absolute psychotic tailspin. And so that made it much more difficult for her to detoxify and to, self-regulate down the road. So she was struggling and continuing to struggle with depression and paranoia. She couldn't even go to Walmart or anything and feel comfortable. And so my niece was told that, my sister was coming to get her, take her back to the psychiatrist, have her put back on drugs. And she decided that she wasn't going to do that. So she first tried to hang herself. She fashioned a rope from her shoelaces and she tied it to a ceiling fan, and she tried to hang herself, but she was unsuccessful because the weight of her body pulled the fan out of the ceiling. So in desperation, she walked into her younger sister's room and she took an oil lantern, poured the oil over herself and ignited it, and she burned herself alive. It was at that point, it was at that moment that I knew that I had nowhere to go but out with the information, that my life's journey, my experience, my knowledge, my profession, my education, all of it had lined up to make me a credible witness and to make me a credible way shower, to explain to people what had happened to my niece, what had happened to me, and what was happening to them. Because the biggest thing that really bowled me over, the thing that I didn't anticipate when I wrote my book and I started speaking out about this subject, was how many victims there were. the vast number of people who had had this experience that I had was it was mind-boggling. And the number of people that were desperate for help, that were turning to professionals, that were turning them away and telling them that there was nothing they could do, that they didn't know how to detoxify people, that they didn't know how to help people get off of the drugs. They were given a life sentence the minute they received that label and that diagnosis, and they were never allowed to try anything else. There were no alternatives that were recommended. There were no other options for these people but to continue to take these toxic chemicals and to become less and less of an individual. They lose their sovereignty spiritually. They lose their rights as citizens. They lose their cognitive abilities. They lose the frontal lobe capacity to think, to create, to be what makes us human. Mm-hmm. And those were the things that I knew I had a moral responsibility now to speak out about. So that was my turning point. When I lost one of the most beautiful people that I had ever known in my life, I made it my life's goal to explain to others why it had happened.
And it sounds like the turning point for her was hearing that she was going to be taken back into the mental hospital.
It absolutely was the turning point, because we had gone to court and everything to try to get her to be able to legally be off drugs. And the court had granted her permission to not be on drugs because she'd been mandated. I mean, once you're told legally by the court, you have to be on drugs, then you have to stay on drugs until the court allows you to get off. And she had gone through that process and had been allowed to get off the drugs, but then she wasn't able to heal quickly enough. And of course, my sister did what everyone does. She deferred to an authority figure. She didn't know what to do, and she asked someone else, and she took that advice and ran with it, and it cost her daughter's life.